The night everything changed, Blaire Kensington was standing in her $6 million kitchen, watching a janitor mop the floor her daughter had just deliberately flooded, and the 8-year-old was staring at him with her arms crossed, chin raised, daring him to break the way every other adult in her life had broken. 12 nannies, 6 months, all gone. And Blaire, who had dismantled hostile corporate boards, survived a vicious divorce, and built a billion-dollar empire from a single algorithm, had no idea what to do with her own child. Then the janitor said 4 words, and Wren had no answer. If you believe that the quietest people in the room are sometimes the most powerful, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop your city and country in the comments right now so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Don't go anywhere. You will want to stay for every single part of this one. The rain came in sideways off Puget Sound that October evening, and by the time Nolan Rourke pulled his 11-year-old Chevy Silverado into the service entrance of the Kensington estate, the wipers were struggling, and the heat in the cab hadn't worked properly in 2 winters. He sat there for a moment before getting out, not because he was nervous. Nolan Rourke hadn't been nervous about anything in a long time, not since the kind of situations where nervousness got people killed had cured him of the habit permanently. He sat there because Caleb had called twice on the drive over, and the second call had gone to voicemail, which meant his 7-year-old son was either asleep at Mrs. Petrakis' house next door, or had fallen asleep trying to stay awake, which amounted to the same thing. He listened to the voicemail. "Dad, it's me. I just wanted to say goodnight. Mrs. P made the soup you showed her. It was pretty good. Not as good as yours. Okay. Good night." Nolan played it twice. Then he got out of the truck. The service entrance to the Kensington estate was around the back, past a 3-car garage that probably cost more than any house on the block where Nolan had grown up in Tacoma. A woman named Greta, the household manager, though she'd introduced herself on the phone with the energy of someone who managed small nations, had given him the code for the gate and a 4-page document outlining the cleaning protocols for the property. 4 pages. For a house. He'd read it on his lunch break at the warehouse, where he worked days moving freight before driving across the city for the evening maintenance contract he'd picked up 3 weeks ago. Kensington account paid better than anything else he'd found since leaving the Navy 14 months earlier. And the hours were strange enough that they didn't interfere with getting Caleb to school in the mornings. He wasn't complaining. Strange hours he could handle. He let himself in through the service door, found the janitorial closet exactly where the 4-page documents said it would be, and began pulling out the equipment. The house was enormous and almost aggressively quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something was being suppressed. Nolan had spent enough time in enough places to know the difference between a quiet house and a silent one. Quiet houses were empty. Silent ones had people in them who weren't talking. This one was silent. He started on the main level floors, working methodically, the way he'd always done everything. He'd covered the formal dining room and was halfway through the corridor leading to the kitchen when he heard it. Crash. Then another. Then the sound of water, a lot of it hitting marble. He walked to the kitchen doorway. The 8-year-old was standing in the middle of the room with her arms at her sides and a knocked-over cleaning bucket at her feet. Dirty water spread across the marble in a slow gray tide. She was in pajamas, expensive ones, the kind with a small embroidered logo on the chest, and her dark hair was loose and tangled, like she'd already been in bed and gotten back up. She was staring at him with the flat, assessing expression of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what would happen next. Nolan looked at the water. He looked at the girl. He went back to the janitorial closet, got a second mop, came back, and started cleaning. The girl didn't move. He worked around her without comment, wringing the mop into the bucket every few passes, and she watched him the whole time with that same flat look, like she was waiting for something. "You're not going to say anything?" she finally said. "About what? About the floor." "Floor's wet," Nolan said. "That happens. I did it on purpose." "I know." She stared at him harder. "You're supposed to be angry." "I'm not angry." "Why not?" Nolan set the mop against the counter and looked at her properly for the first time. She was small for 8, fine-boned, with her mother's sharp jaw, though he didn't know that yet. She had dark circles under her eyes that no 8-year-old should have, and her shoulders were drawn up slightly, the way people held themselves when they were braced for something. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked suspicious. "You don't know my name?" "I know your last name." "The document I got," said Kensington, "didn't say what you go by." Something crossed her face. Not quite surprised, but close. Wren. He picked up the mop again. I'm Nolan. You're the janitor. Tonight I am. What does that mean? It means that's what I'm doing tonight. She was quiet for a moment, watching him mop. The other ones always got mad. Other ones. The nannies. Nolan didn't say anything to that. There were 12 of them, Friend said, and the way she said it wasn't bragging, it was flat. Almost clinical, the way you'd recite a number you'd counted carefully. Miss Loretta lasted the longest. 3 weeks. What'd you do to Miss Loretta? She hesitated, like the question surprised her. I put her car keys in the blender. Did you turn it on? No. Then she got her keys back. She still left. Yeah, Nolan said. People do. Wren's chin lifted slightly. Everybody leaves. Nolan kept mopping. He didn't look up. He didn't do anything dramatic, didn't stop and turn and deliver a speech. He just kept working because the floor was still wet, and when he finally answered her, it was in the same even tone he'd used to say everything else. Then I guess somebody needs to stay. The kitchen went quiet again. Wren stared at the back of his head, and for the first time in 6 months longer, if she was honest, longer than she could comfortably remember, she didn't have a single word for what came next. Blaire Kensington found out about the flooded kitchen floor the next morning from Greta, who delivered the information with the controlled expression of someone who had spent 2 years carefully not editorializing about the situation inside this house. The new maintenance contractor cleaned it up, Greta said, setting a coffee down on the kitchen island. Apparently Wren was up. Blaire looked at the floor. Spotless. Was anything broken? No. What did he say to her? Greta paused. I'm not sure. Wren went back to bed without incident. Blaire stared at the floor another moment. Then she opened her laptop and went back to the quarterly security sitting in her inbox, because there were 47 other things demanding her attention before 9 a.m., and she didn't have time to read meaning into a child going to bed without incident. She should have read meaning into it, but Blaire Kensington had built an empire by being decisive and fast and always knowing which problems were worth solving personally and which ones could be delegated. Wren, she was ashamed to admit this, and she did not admit it. Not to anyone. Wren had been quietly delegated for years. Not intentionally, not cruelly. Blaire loved her daughter with a ferocity she couldn't always translate into the right actions. But the company had needed her more urgently, in more concrete and measurable ways, for a very long time, and somewhere in the accumulated weight of those years, Wren had gone from a problem Blaire was actively trying to solve to a problem she was managing from a distance. 12 nannies. She hadn't recognized what that number meant. She'd seen it as Wren's failure difficult child. Oppositional behavior probably needed a firmer hand, a better specialist, a different approach. She'd hired 2 child psychologists. Both had said things about attachment that Blaire had noted and then not acted on, because action would have required slowing down, and slowing down wasn't something the company could currently absorb. She picked up her phone and dialed into the 815. Downstairs, Wren sat at the kitchen table eating cereal and watching the service entrance door the way you watch a door when you're not sure if something you thought happened actually happened. Nolan came back 3 nights later. Wren was ready for him. She'd hidden the replacement mop heads, all 4 of them, in the linen closet on the 3rd floor, behind a stack of monogrammed guest towels that hadn't been used in 2 years. She'd also rearranged the contents of the janitorial closet so that nothing was where the original 4-page document said it would be. She positioned herself in the hallway with a book she wasn't reading and watched him open the janitorial closet. He stood there looking at the rearranged shelves for a moment. Then he started taking stock. He worked out what was missing, found the substitute supplies in the utility closet near the garage, and adapted without making a sound. Wren watched him from the hallway. The mop heads are gone. I noticed. Aren't you going to ask where they are? If you wanted to tell me, you'd tell me. She followed him at a distance as he started on the front hall. Don't you want to know why I did it? Not particularly. She frowned. Why not? Nolan wrung out the substitute mop, a shorter one, slightly the wrong size for the handle, clearly annoying to use, and kept going. Because I figure you had your reasons. And they're your reasons, not mine. What if my reason is I just wanted to make your job harder? Then that's your reason. And you're okay with that? He thought about it for a second. It's not really about whether I'm okay with it. Wren trailed him into the formal dining room. You're weird, she announced. Probably. All the other ones would yell. Did yelling help? She paused. No, so. She stood in the doorway watching him work. The mop heads are in the linen closet, 3rd floor, behind the fancy towels. Nolan nodded. I'll get them in a minute. This one's working fine. She watched him for another minute. Then she went upstairs and got the mop heads herself and brought them back down and set them on the kitchen counter without saying anything. Nolan looked at them. Thanks. I wasn't being nice, Wren said immediately.
Okay.
I just figured if you had the right mop, it'd be quieter. That's practical. She smiled. She killed it before it happened, but it had been close. Blaire saw them together for the first time 2 weeks in. She'd come home from a dinner that had run 3 hours too long, one of those industry events, where the real conversations happened in parking garages and elevator lobbies, and she'd slipped in through the front door at 11:15 expecting a quiet house. Kitchen light was on. She stopped in the doorway. Nolan was at the sink, cleaning the stainless steel basin the way the protocol document specified, and Wren was sitting on the kitchen counter, something she was absolutely not allowed to do, with a bowl of cereal, talking. Not performing, not calculating, just talking. Because the rule is stupid, Wren was saying. You think a lot of rules are stupid, Nolan said. A lot of rules are stupid. Give me one that isn't. Wren thought about it, swinging her feet against the cabinet. Don't run by the pool. Why is that one okay? Because there's a real reason. You could slip and crack your head. Right. So the rule connects to something. Yeah. So when a rule feels stupid, it means it doesn't connect to anything, Wren said. Then her face did something complicated. Or it means nobody explained the connection. Nolan rinsed the basin. That's a good distinction. My teacher would say I overthink things. Your teacher's wrong. Wren looked at him sideways. You're not supposed to say, adults are wrong. Why not? Because. That's not a reason. She laughed a real one, short and surprised, the kind that snuck out before she could decide whether to allow it. Blaire stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she walked quietly back to the stairs, went up to her room and sat on the edge of her bed in her coat without turning on the light. 12 nannies, specialists, protocols, and a janitor was sitting on the kitchen floor. She realized she'd missed it. He'd moved to the floor to get the base of the cabinets. He was actually working the whole time talking to her daughter about the logic of rules at 11:15 on a Tuesday, and Wren was on the counter eating cereal and laughing. Blaire sat there a long time. She didn't know what to do with what she felt. She only knew it was something she hadn't felt in a long time, the specific and uncomfortable sensation of realizing you've been solving the wrong problem. In Tacoma, in a small house on a street where the neighbors knew each other's dogs by name, Caleb Rourke was asleep under a comforter his mother had picked out 3 years before she died. It had rockets on it. He was too old for it now. Probably, but he'd never said so, and Nolan had never suggested changing it, because some things you leave alone. On the kitchen table was a drawing Caleb had made at school, a family portrait, per the assignment. 4 figures himself. His dad. A woman whose hair he'd colored with yellow crayon he'd pressed too hard. And a small figure beside her, dark-haired, arms crossed, scowling in a way that was somehow still meant to be friendly. His teacher had asked who the small figure was. Caleb had thought about it. A girl my dad talks about, he'd said. She sounds like trouble, but the good kind. His teacher had written that down. Some things, even at 7, you get right the first time. The mopheads incident was only the beginning. Blaire Kensington had spent 6 months developing a precise and highly effective system for making adults leave, and she wasn't about to abandon it just because one of them had failed to react correctly the first 2 times. She told herself that Nolan was simply slower than the others, that it would take more, that eventually she'd find the thing that broke him, because everything broke eventually if you applied the right pressure in the right place. She'd learned that from watching her mother run a company, even if Blaire would have been horrified to know it. So she escalated. The 3rd week, she poured a full bottle of floor wax into the bucket Nolan used for the marble entryway, not water, wax, which turned the entryway into something resembling a skating rink and required 3 hours of work to reverse. She watched from the 2nd floor landing while Nolan discovered it, stood very still for a moment, and then went back to the supply closet to figure out the solvent situation. He didn't yell. He didn't even sigh loud enough for her to hear. He just fixed it. The way he fixed everything methodically, without drama, without making her feel like the problem was her rather than the floor. The 4th week, she locked him on the terrace. It was a calculated move. The terrace off the main living room had a door that latched from the inside, and she'd spent 3 days figuring out the exact moment in his cleaning routine when he'd step out to clean the exterior glass panels. She timed it perfectly, waited until he was outside, crossed the room, flipped the latch, and sat down on the couch with a book like she hadn't done anything. It was 41 degrees outside. October in Seattle had no mercy. She sat there for 4 minutes before she heard him knock. Not pounding, not frantic. 2 deliberate knocks. The way you knock on a door when you're not panicking and you want the person on the other side to know it. She didn't move. He knocked twice more. Ren. She turned a page she hadn't read. The door latch got flipped, he said through the glass. His voice was conversational, like he was describing the weather. I can wait out here. It's not bad. But if Greta finds out, she'll probably decide I need to be supervised, and then neither of us will have any peace. Ren stared at her book. Also, Nolan added, I can see your reflection in the glass. You're not actually reading. She looked up. He was right. The terrace glass at that angle caught the interior light and bounced it back. She could see herself, which meant he could see her. She got up and flipped the latch. Nolan came back in, rubbing his hands together to get the feeling back in his fingers. He didn't say anything about the lock. He picked up his cleaning supplies and continued. You could have called for Greta, Ren said. I could have. Why didn't you? He considered this with what seemed like genuine thought. Because you didn't need to get in trouble. You needed to see what I'd do. Ren stared at him. What did you do, Knocked? That's it? What else was there to do? She didn't have an answer for that either. It was becoming a pattern, this specific silence she kept landing in, where she'd prepared for a reaction that didn't come, and she'd be left standing in the wreckage of her own plan with nothing to do. She hated it. She also, in a way she couldn't name yet and wouldn't have admitted to anyone, found it a relief. The day she mocked his uniform was a Thursday. He'd arrived in his work clothes, the way he always did, dark navy blue maintenance pants, a gray thermal under a zip jacket, with the name of the cleaning company stitched on the chest. The stitching had started fraying at one corner. Ren had noticed it weeks earlier. She noticed everything. It was one of the more exhausting things about being her. She was in a bad mood that Thursday. She didn't always know why her bad moods arrived. They just did. A pressure behind her eyes and a tightness in her chest, and suddenly everything was too much, and the only way to make it slightly less too much was to transfer some of it outward. Your uniform is falling apart, she said. She said it the way you say something when you want it to land like a stone. Nolan looked down at the fraying stitching. Yep, you should get a new one, probably. It looks cheap. He nodded slowly, like he was considering this feedback. It's a work uniform. It's supposed to get wrecked. Still, she crossed her arms. It's embarrassing. The word hung there. She'd aimed it deliberately at him, at the difference between his worn jacket and the marble floors he was cleaning, at everything she'd watched enough adults to know was supposed to matter. Nolan looked at her for a moment, not angry, not wounded. Something else, a look she couldn't categorize, like he was making a small adjustment in how he understood something. Embarrassing for who? He asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. He continued. Not pressing, just asking. Or did you mean it the way people mean it when they want somebody else to feel small? The room went quiet. Ren's face went through several things at once. Shame was in there somewhere. But shame in 8-year-olds rarely arrives clean. It comes attached to anger and deflection, because the alternative is sitting with something that feels impossible. I didn't mean anything, she said. Okay, I was just saying. Okay, you don't have to make it into something. I'm not making it into anything, Nolan said. He picked up the mop. I just want to make sure we're saying what we're actually saying. Saves time. She stood there for another moment, her arms still crossed, and then she walked out of the room without another word. She went upstairs, got into bed at 7:30 in the evening, and lay on her back staring at the ceiling. She hadn't meant to say it like that. Or maybe she had, and hated herself for it. She wasn't always sure where the line was. What Nolan understood about Ren, and what he'd understood within the first 2 weeks, because he'd been trained to read people in situations where misreading them had consequences, was that her behavior had nothing to do with him. Sounds obvious, stated plainly. But most adults took Ren's provocations personally, because most adults were wired to treat a child's hostility as a problem to be corrected rather than a message to be decoded. The nannies had been patient by the standards of their training, but patience that comes from professional obligation has a floor. and Wren had been systematically finding every floor for 6 months. Nolan didn't have that kind of patience. What he had was different, the product of years in environments where your own emotional reactions were irrelevant, where what mattered was reading the situation correctly and responding to what was actually happening rather than what appeared to be happening. What was actually happening with Wren was not complicated, once you looked at it straight. She was terrified. The anger was real. The behavior was real. The capability for destruction, the sprinkler incident, the car keys in the blender, all 12 nannies, that was all real. But underneath it, driving all of it, was a fear so constant that she'd stopped being aware of it as fear. It had become the air she breathed, the ground she stood on. The certainty that anyone who got close enough to matter would eventually find a reason to leave. So she gave them reasons. She handed the reasons over early, before they could manufacture their own, before she was invested enough that the leaving would hollow her out completely. She controlled the terms of abandonment because she couldn't control abandonment itself, and that made the math bearable. Nolan had seen this before. Not in a child, in grown men in high-pressure units, in guys who picked fights with teammates before a deployment because pushing people away felt safer than depending on them in a situation where depending on someone could get you killed. The specifics were different. The mechanism was identical. He never told Wren he understood this. That would have been the wrong move, heavy-handed, the kind of thing that makes a kid feel observed and categorized rather than simply known. Instead, he did what he'd learned worked. He reduced the stakes. He made their interactions about small, concrete things. Mop heads, floor wax, the logic of rules, the fraying on his uniform. Kept showing up. That was the whole strategy. Not clever, not sophisticated. Just showing up, doing the work, not flinching, and waiting for the space between her defenses to widen on its own. It was working. He could tell, not because she'd gotten easier, she hadn't, particularly, but because the nature of what she threw at him had shifted. The early provocations had been designed to create maximum inconvenience and trigger maximum reaction. The recent ones were smaller, more personal. She was testing different things now. Not can I break him, but what will he do when? What will he do when I say something cruel? What will he do when I ignore him? What will he do when I'm in a bad mood and take it out on someone who doesn't deserve it? She was asking real questions now, dressed up as provocations. He took every single one of them seriously. The routine shifted gradually, the way routines do when the people inside them stop fighting them. Nolan's schedule had him in the house 3 nights a week, Mondays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. By the 5th week, Wren had started staying up later on those nights. Not obviously. She didn't come downstairs and announce herself. But he'd hear her on the stairs, or find her in the kitchen when he came to do the counters, or catch her shadow in the hallway when he was working in the library. The library was where things changed first. The Kensington Library was a room Blaire used as an additional office, a long, narrow, space-lined floor to ceiling with books that were organized by someone with genuine taste and left untouched by anyone who actually intended to read them. Nolan dusted and vacuumed in there, and on his 3rd Thursday, he came in to find the entire lower shelf on the east wall had been pulled out and scattered across the floor. Books everywhere, open and face down and stacked at wrong angles, every single one of them damaged in the way you damage a book when you don't care about it, cracking spines and folding pages back. Wren was sitting in the leather armchair in the corner, watching him. She had her arms across her chest and her chin up, and her eyes doing the thing where they tracked everything without giving anything away. Nolan looked at the books. He set down his cleaning supplies. He crouched and picked up the nearest one, a thick collection of American poetry, the cover worn soft with old use. He looked at the spine, then at the shelf. "Come here," he said. Wren didn't move. "I need to know the system," Nolan said. "How were these organized?" "I don't know. I didn't organize them. So we have to figure it out." He turned the poetry book over. There was a small label on the spine, a faded sticker with handwriting on it. Somebody categorized these by hand. "Look." He held the book out toward her. She didn't come, but she leaned forward slightly to see. "There are labels," he said. "That means there's a logic. If we find the logic, we can put them back right." Wren was quiet for a moment. Why does it matter if they're back right? Because somebody cared enough to label them. Nobody reads them. That doesn't mean nobody cared. He set the poetry collection down and picked up another one. History. Different label. Different handwriting, older. More careful. These are two different people's writing. You see that? Despite herself, Wren got out of the chair and came to look. Crouched beside him on the floor, looking at the two books. That one's older, she said, pointing to the history book. Yeah, someone started this collection a long time ago. Someone else added to it later. He looked at the shelves. Your mom? Wren shrugged, a tight motion, maybe. Before. He didn't push that. Before what he could guess. He didn't need her to say it. Help me sort them, he said. Why would I do that? I'm the one who made the mess.
Right.
So help me sort them, she looked at him. You're doing that thing again. What thing? Where you turn what I did into something I'm supposed to fix, instead of something I'm supposed to get yelled at for. Nolan sat back on his heels and thought about that. Do you want to get yelled at? Wren's jaw tightened. No, then let's sort. She stayed on the floor beside him. They worked through the books together, finding the label system subject first, then author's last name within the subject, with the two handwriting styles interleaved across decades, and it took 40 minutes, which meant Nolan ran late on the rest of the house and had to skip the second-floor bathrooms entirely. He didn't mention that part. When they were done, Wren stood back and looked at the shelf. The books were all back. The room looked right again. She had her arms at her sides now, not crossed, which was something he noticed. It's the same, she said. Almost. That one's a half-inch off. He pointed to a book near the end. She reached over and straightened it. Now it's the same, he said. She looked at the shelf for another moment. Then she looked at him sideways. You're going to be late finishing. Little bit. Greta's going to notice. Probably. Are you going to tell her why? He considered. I'll tell her I got behind. Which is true. Wren looked at the shelf again. You're not going to blame me. For what? She opened her mouth, closed it. Her eyes did the thing again, tracking, assessing, but there was something different underneath now, something less armored. Nothing, she said finally. Never mind. She left. He heard her go up the stairs. He stood in the library for a moment, looking at the neatly organized shelves. Then he picked up his equipment and went to catch up on the rest of the house. He brought Caleb to the estate once, on a Saturday morning, not during his work hours, but after, when Greta had asked if he could take a quick look at the utility room plumbing before a plumber was called, because Nolan had mentioned in passing that he knew basic pipe work, which he'd learned from a petty officer in his second year who'd believed that any SEAL who couldn't fix a toilet had no business calling himself self-sufficient. He brought Caleb because the after-school program wasn't running Saturdays and misses. Petrakis had a family thing, and Nolan hadn't been able to find another option on short notice. He told Caleb to sit in the kitchen and not touch anything, an instruction Caleb received with the practiced nod of a child who had learned that his dad meant things when he said them. Wren came downstairs 20 minutes later. Nolan was still in the utility room. Caleb was sitting at the kitchen island with a library book about submarines, which he was reading with the specific intensity of a kid who found one thing genuinely interesting and read everything about it. Wren stopped in the kitchen doorway. Caleb looked up. They stared at each other, the way children stare at each other, the immediate, unfiltered assessment that adults lose the ability to do honestly by the time they're 16. Who are you? Wren said. Caleb, who are you? I live here. Oh. He looked around the kitchen. It's big, I know. Is it weird living somewhere this big? Wren blinked. Adults never ask that. Sometimes, she said. Then cautiously, why are you here? My dad's fixing something. He said, sit and don't touch anything. Your dad is the janitor. He's not just a janitor, Caleb said, with the mildly offended tone of someone correcting a basic factual error rather than defending an insult. He does other stuff, too. Like what? Caleb seemed to consider how much to say. Lots of things. He used to be in the Navy. Wren came a step into the kitchen. My grandfather was in the Navy. My dad was a SEAL. Stopped. Really? He doesn't talk about it, Caleb said, in a way that made clear he'd been told this as a reason not to ask rather than as a mystery to solve. He went back to his book. Wren stood there a moment longer. Then she came all the way into the kitchen, pulled out the stool 2 down from Caleb's, and sat down. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. After a while, she pulled over a bowl of apples that had been sitting on the counter and ate one without offering him one, which he didn't seem to notice, and then she felt strange about it and pushed the bowl toward him without saying anything. He took one without saying anything either. They sat like that, 2 kids, one book about submarines, one bowl of apples going down slowly for the 30 minutes it took Nolan to sort out the plumbing issue. When he came back into the kitchen and saw them, He didn't comment on it. He just washed his hands, told Caleb time to go, and looked at Wren. Pipe under the utility sink had a slow drip, he said. Greta should know it'll need a proper replacement in a few months, but it'll hold for now. Wren nodded, like this was information she was responsible for relaying, which it wasn't, but she nodded anyway. Thanks for the apple, Caleb said to her, as Nolan steered him toward the door. Wren looked surprised. Then, it was just an apple. Still, Caleb said. She watched them leave through the service entrance. She heard the Silverado start up, back out, and pull away. The sound of it faded until the house was just the house again, big and quiet, and full of the particular silence she'd grown up in. She put the bowl of apples back where it had been. Then she stood in the kitchen for a moment, in that silence, and the thing in her chest that had been clenched for longer than she could remember felt, for just a second, like it had loosened a half-inch, like a book that had been sitting slightly wrong on a shelf, now straightened. Blaire found out about the library. Not from Greta, who hadn't noticed. Not from Nolan, who hadn't said anything. She found out because she went into the library 2 weeks after the incident to find a contract document she'd left on the reading table. And she noticed the books were all precisely where they were supposed to be, which was unusual, because she'd been watching them migrate out of order for months, as Wren worked her way along the shelves, looking for something to be angry at. She stood in the library looking at the shelves. Then she went to find Greta and asked, as neutrally as she could manage, whether anyone had been in the library recently. Greta considered. Mr. Rourke mentioned he'd reorganized the east shelf. Some books had gotten displaced. Blaire looked at her. Just him? A slight pause. I believe Wren may have been awake. She often is on his nights. Blaire went back to the library and stood there a while longer. She thought about the contract document she'd come in for. She found it. She stood there, holding it and looking at the shelves, the careful label system she'd started when she was 23, when she'd bought this house and spent 3 weeks cataloging the books she'd collected since college, and then the labels in her mother's handwriting added later. After her mother had spent a month here recovering from surgery and had decided Blaire's organization was incomplete and needed the fiction section expanded. Her mother had died 4 years ago. The labels were still there. Wren had helped put the books back right. Blaire held the contract document and didn't move for a long time. The evening she overheard the real thing, the thing that finally broke through the careful professional distance she'd been maintaining around what was happening in her own house, was a Thursday in late November, about 6 weeks into Nolan's contract. Come home early. Not intentionally early, a meeting had collapsed when the other party's lead counsel got sick and had to reschedule, and Blaire had found herself in the car at 7:45, with nowhere to be until 9 the next morning, which almost never happened and felt slightly disorienting, the way a flight arriving an hour early feels disorienting when you're not expecting it. She let herself in quietly. Habit. She was always quiet coming home because she'd learned early that arriving loudly interrupted whatever tentative peace Greta had managed to establish with Wren before bedtime. Kitchen light was on. She could hear voices. She stopped in the hallway. Wren's voice, lower than usual. She was going to come back. Nolan, yeah, but then she didn't. No. Silence for a moment. Blaire stood completely still. Does Caleb ask about her? Wren asked. Sometimes. What do you tell him? The truth. That she got sick. That it wasn't anybody's fault. That she would have stayed if she could. Wren was quiet for longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice had gone to a place Blaire had almost never heard it go, not angry, not performing, not calculating, just small. My dad didn't get sick. Nolan didn't answer right away. Blaire heard a chair shift the kitchen stool, the sound it made on the tile. No, he said finally. He didn't. He just decided to go. I don't know what he decided. I wasn't there, he decided, Wren said. Smallness was gone. Something harder had replaced it, but it was the kind of hard that comes from pressing something small and hurting down very flat. He just decided we weren't, that I wasn't. She stopped. Nolan waited. I make them leave, Wren said. It came out different from the way she usually said things. No performance to it. Just a statement, flat and final, like something she'd been carrying around and finally set on the table. The nannies. I make them leave before they can decide to. Kitchen was completely quiet. I know, Nolan said. You know? I figured it out. And you're still here. It wasn't a question. It was something more complicated than a question. Still here, Nolan said. Blaire stood in the hallway with her hand on the wall and her coat still on and the contract documents from earlier still in her bag, and she understood in one clear, awful, completely undeniable moment that she had missed it. Not missed it the way you miss a detail in a contract. Missed it the way you miss years. Wren hadn't been driving the nannies away because she was difficult. She hadn't been testing them because she was oppositional or troubled or whatever clinical language the psychologists had offered. She was doing the only thing that made sense to her, given what she understood about how people worked. She was establishing control over an outcome she was terrified of, making adults leave before they could leave on their own, so that she was the one holding the cause rather than absorbing the effect. Blaire's daughter had learned, at 8 years old, that the safest version of abandonment was the one she engineered herself. And where had she learned it? Blaire stayed in the hallway for a while. She didn't go into the kitchen. She wasn't sure what she would have said, and she'd spent enough years in boardrooms to know that the moments when you don't know what to say are rarely the moments to speak. She went upstairs instead. She sat in her room in her coat, the way she had that first night she'd seen them together, and this time she stayed there much longer, until she heard Nolan leave through the service entrance, and the house went quiet, and finally she heard Wren come upstairs and the soft click of her daughter's bedroom door. Blaire sat in the dark. She thought about a lot of things she hadn't let herself think about in a long time. How long she'd been using work as a barrier. How many evenings she'd delegated. How her own father had worked 16-hour days, and she'd grown up proud of him for it, and how she'd built her own life on that same blueprint, without ever questioning whether the blueprint was right. How Wren's worst behavior had never been rebellion. It had been a mirror. The following Saturday, Nolan arrived to find a note on the kitchen counter in handwriting he didn't recognize, adult handwriting, precise and controlled, the kind that comes from someone who writes a lot and writes fast. Mr. Rourke, I'd like to speak with you when you have a moment. BK. He found Blaire in the library, standing at the window with a coffee she'd clearly forgotten about, looking out at the gray November water in the distance. When he came in, she looked tired, not the performative exhaustion of someone who wanted you to know they were busy, but the real kind, bone deep, the kind that comes from lying awake thinking. I overheard you, she said. No preamble. He'd been right, weeks earlier, that she was someone who said what she meant when she'd decided to say it. Last Thursday in the kitchen. He nodded once. I want to know, she said, then stopped. She set the coffee down on the reading table and folded her hands in front of her, and he could see her choosing words carefully, which was probably not something she often had to do. I want to know how you knew, what she was doing, why she was doing it. It's not complicated, Nolan said. It felt complicated to me. Sometimes complicated things have simple reasons underneath. Blaire looked at him. What's the reason? She's scared you'll leave too, he said, like her dad did. So she gets there first. Blaire absorbed this the way you absorb something you already knew but needed to hear out loud. I'm not leaving, she said. I know that. She doesn't. No, Nolan agreed. She doesn't. Not yet. Blaire picked up the coffee. Put it back down. What do I do? He thought about it. You stay in the room, he said, even when she makes it hard. Especially when she makes it hard. Blaire was quiet for a moment. Outside, the water was silver gray under cloud cover, and somewhere in the house a heating vent clicked on, and the room smelled like old paper and coffee, and the particular complicated quiet of a house that was also a question. She helped with the books, Blaire said finally. She did. My mother's handwriting is on half those labels. I noticed. 2 different people started the collection. Blaire looked at the shelves. My mother would have liked Wren, she said, and there was something in her voice that had nothing careful about it. She would have thought she was magnificent. The difficult ones always were to her. Nolan didn't say anything. Some things you let sit. After a moment, Blaire straightened, and the careful, controlled expression came back, not a mask, exactly. More like load-bearing structure, the thing she used to get through days that required her to function. Thank you, she said, for staying. It's the job, Nolan said. Blaire looked at him. No, she said quietly. It isn't. He didn't argue with her. He picked up his equipment and went back to work. December came in cold and wet, the way Seattle Decembers always did. And the Kensington estate lolled into something that wasn't quite routine, but was at least recognizable, a shape to the weeks that hadn't existed 2 months earlier. Wren still tested things. She probably always would, at least for a while. But the tests had changed in nature, the way Nolan had noticed before. Less destruction, more provocation, and underneath the provocation, something that was starting to look, cautiously, like curiosity. She asked him questions now. About the Navy, which he answered carefully and partially. About Caleb, which he answered more freely. About whether he ever got lonely, which he deflected by asking her the same question back, which she answered by going quiet in a way that was its own answer. Blaire had changed too, though more slowly and with more resistance, the way people change when the change requires them to admit they've been wrong about something they built a life on. She started coming home earlier. Not always, not dramatically, but on Tuesdays she was home by 7, and on Thursdays she ate dinner with Wren at the kitchen table instead of in her office with a laptop open, and she asked questions and stayed in the room when the answers were uncomfortable, which was what Nolan had told her to do. It was not smooth. It was not a movie version of a mother and daughter reconnecting, with soft lighting and forgiveness arriving in tidy packages. Wren was still Wren-guarded, sharp, prone to silence when she felt cornered. She didn't suddenly open up because Blaire started eating dinner at the table. The first 3 dinners were exercises in polite tension, the kind that made you want to check your phone just to have somewhere else to put your eyes. But Blaire didn't check her phone. She kept her phone face down on the counter, and she stayed at the table, and she asked about school in a way that wasn't interrogation. And eventually, on the 4th Tuesday, because these things don't happen until they happen, Wren said something real. Something small but real. "There's a girl in my class," Wren said, pushing rice around on her plate. "Madison. She tells everyone she's my best friend." Blaire waited. "But she only talks to me when she needs something, like homework help or when her other friends are busy." Blaire put her fork down. "How does that make you feel?" Wren looked up, slightly suspicious of the question's sincerity. Then she seemed to decide it was genuine. "Stupid," she said, "for thinking it was real." "It's not stupid to want real things," Blaire said. Wren poked at her food. "You always know when something is just business, right? With your company. Usually." "How?" Blaire thought about it, actually thought about it, not the automatic reassuring answer. "When someone is only interested in you when they need something from you, there's a pattern to it. The attention comes in a specific way at specific times. It's not random the way real interest is." Wren was quiet for a moment, processing this. Real interest is random? Real interest is inconsistent. Genuine people are interested in you on Tuesday for no reason, not just when there's a project due. Wren sat with that. Then, "Nolan asks about my drawings. I haven't shown him any. He just noticed one on the counter one time." Blaire recognized the particular weight of what her daughter had just said, that she'd used Nolan as her measuring stick for genuine interest. She felt something small and uncomfortable about that, but she didn't let it show. "He does that," Blaire said. "Notices things. He noticed the labels in the library." "I know." Wren finally took a bite, chewed. "Madison borrowed my colored pencils 2 weeks ago and never gave them back. Do you want me to—" "No, firmly. I'll handle it." Blaire almost smiled. She kept it controlled. "Okay." It wasn't a breakthrough. It was smaller than that. But it was the kind of small thing that accumulates, the way interest accumulates quietly. Off to the side, until one day, the sum of it is something you didn't realize you'd been building. Problem arrived in the 2nd week of December, and it arrived sideways, the way problems do when you're not watching the right angle. Wren had a tutor, a woman named Dr. Hargrove, who came on Wednesday evenings and worked with Wren on the advanced mathematics curriculum Blaire had enrolled her in, which was 2 grade levels above where Wren was in school, and had been Blaire's answer to her daughter's restlessness, the assumption being that boredom was the root of the problem rather than pain. Dr. Hargrove was efficient, credentialed, and possessed of the specific inflexibility that comes from spending 20 years being the most competent person in most rooms. She had a system. The system worked, statistically. She was disinclined to deviate from the system. On the 2nd Wednesday in December, Nolan arrived at 5:30 for an overlap with his maintenance schedule. Greta had asked him to handle a situation with the heating vents on the upper level, which required working earlier than his usual hours. Came in through the service entrance, the way he always did, and was working on the 3rd-floor vent system when he passed the hallway outside Wren's study room and heard what was happening inside. Dr. Hargrove was explaining, for what sounded like the 3rd or 4th time based on her tone, a concept involving algebraic functions. And Wren, not angry, not defiant, but something more concerning to Nolan's ear, was simply silent. He knew that silence. Not the calculating silence, Not the self-protective silence, but the specific and particular silence of someone who had checked out completely, who had gone somewhere internal where the external environment couldn't reach. He'd seen it in men after certain operations. It wasn't refusal. It was absence. He set down his equipment quietly. The function maps one value to exactly one output, Dr. Hargrove was saying. That's the definition. A vertical line can only intersect the graph once. Ren, are you following? Nothing. Ren. Nolan knocked on the open door. Dr. Hargrove looked up with the expression of someone who had not invited an interruption. This is a tutoring session. I know. I'm sorry to interrupt. He looked at Ren. She was sitting very still, hands flat on the table, eyes focused on the middle distance just above the textbook. Can I steal her for 10 minutes? We're in the middle of. I know. 10 minutes. I need help with something on the 3rd floor. Dr. Hargrove drew herself up slightly. Mr. Rourke. 10 minutes. Ren blinked. She looked at him with the slow refocus of someone coming back from a distance. Come on, he said to her. She got up. She followed him out into the hallway and up the stairs without asking where they were going. He led her to the small sitting area at the end of the 3rd floor hall, a window seat looking out over the water, with a blanket folded on one end that nobody had used in months, and he sat down on the opposite end and didn't say anything. Ren sat. She looked out the window. Below, the lights of the city were blurring in the rain. I don't have anything against algebra, she said, eventually. I know. I was doing fine until she said the thing about the vertical line. And then I don't know. My brain she stopped. Went somewhere else, Nolan said. Yeah. He leaned back against the wall. You eat anything since school? She looked at him sideways. What does that have to do with algebra? Nothing. Did you eat? A little. I wasn't hungry, he nodded. Sometimes when you're running low on food and someone keeps repeating the same thing at you, your brain makes an executive decision to stop processing it. Is that a real thing? Very real thing. Ren pulled the blanket onto her lap without seeming to think about it. I hate when she repeats herself. It makes me feel stupid. You're not stupid. I know I'm not stupid, she said with a flash of the old sharpness. What makes it worse? She's explaining it like I'm stupid, and I understand that I'm not stupid, but the understandings isn't helping with the algebra. Nolan was quiet for a moment. The function thing. Where'd she lose you exactly? Ren looked at him. You know algebra? Some. She thought about it. She kept saying one input, one output. But she wasn't saying why it mattered. Like who decided that rule, and why does it make something a function versus not a function? She just kept saying the definition without explaining what problem it was solving. Nolan thought about this. Okay, you know how a vending machine works? Yes. You put in $1 and press B4. What do you expect to come out? Whatever's in B4. Right. One button, one thing. Because if you pressed B4 and sometimes got chips and sometimes got nothing and sometimes got 2 things, the machine would be useless. You'd have no way of predicting what you'd get, so you couldn't rely on it. Ren was quiet. A function is a machine, Nolan said. Same input always gives same output. That's not just a rule, that's what makes it usable. A machine that gives random outputs isn't a machine, it's just noise. Ren stared out the window. She didn't say that. Different people explain things different ways. You should be a teacher. I'm a janitor, Nolan said. She looked at him. You said that before. Like that's the end of it. It's not a criticism. It's just the job I have. But it's not all you are. He looked at her steadily. No, it's not. They sat there another minute. Outside, a gust of rain moved across the window like static. I should go back, Ren said. She didn't sound dreading it the way she had sounded 10 minutes ago.
Yeah.
She got up, set the blanket back in its fold, stopped at the end of the window seat. Do you think she'll say something to my mom? About you taking me out of the session? Possibly. Mom will be annoyed. Probably. Ren looked at him. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Worth it, though, she said. He watched her go back down the hall. He stayed at the window for another minute, looking out at the rain-blurred city, and let himself think about Caleb at home with Mrs. Petrakis, and whether the soup had been reheated properly, and whether his son's homework was finished, and all the ordinary things that made up the background noise of a life that didn't look like much from the outside, but was, he thought, fundamentally okay. Then he went back to the heating vents. Dr. Hargrove did say something to Blaire. She said it in a carefully worded email that arrived at 10:45 that night, which Blaire read standing at the kitchen counter in her bathrobe, and which described the interruption in language that managed to be professionally neutral while communicating. Between every line, that boundaries had been crossed and authority had been undermined. Blaire read it twice. Then she put her phone down and thought. The thinking lasted longer than it usually did, because she was not, this time, operating with the clean certainty she usually brought to problems. 2 months earlier, she would have read Dr. Hargrove's email and made a decision within 30 seconds. She would have called Nolan in the morning and explained clearly and not unkindly that his role in the household had specific parameters, and that inserting himself into scheduled educational programming, however well-intentioned, was outside those parameters. She still believed in parameters. She still believed in structure. Blaire Kensington had built her company on the understanding that competent people in defined roles produced better outcomes than everyone freelancing based on their own judgment. But she'd also been watching what happened when someone applied a different model entirely to her daughter. And the results were she didn't know what to call them. Better. Slower than she was comfortable with, less measurable than she preferred, but better in ways that Dr. Hargrove's measurable, structured, credentialed approach had not produced. She picked up the phone again. She put it down. She'd talked to him in person. Nolan came on Thursday. Blaire met him in the kitchen before he'd gotten his equipment out, which was unusual. He clocked it immediately, the way she was standing, the particular set of her shoulders that he'd started to be able to read, the coffee cup she was holding that had clearly been refilled twice already for a woman who usually had one. Dr. Hargrove emailed you, he said. She did. I figured she might. Blaire set the coffee down. Walk me through what happened. He did. Clean and direct Wren's state when he'd found her, what he'd observed, what he'd done and why. He didn't apologize for the interruption, but he didn't frame it as a judgment on Dr. Hargrove either. He just described what he'd seen and what decision he'd made and the reasoning behind it. Blaire listened without interrupting. She was shutting. Nolan finished. Not refusing. Not being difficult. She'd hit a wall, and the environment wasn't giving her any way out. I took her out of it for 10 minutes, and she went back in fine. Dr. Hargrove said the session didn't recover well after the interruption. Possible. I didn't stay to watch. Blaire looked at him. You made a call that wasn't yours to make. I did. Without consulting me or Greta. Yes, why? He thought about it. Because it needed to happen in the moment, not after a consultation. Wren wasn't going to get better if we waited for the right approval chain. Blaire held his gaze. There was something she was working through behind her eyes. He could see it. The way she weighed things when she was genuinely uncertain rather than just considering. She does better with you than she does with anyone else in this house, Blaire said. Cost her something to say that, he could tell, including me, which I'm aware of. She's getting better with you. Don't do that. Do what? Be diplomatic. I'm not asking for reassurance. I'm asking you to help me understand. She stopped. Started again. I have spent a lot of money on the right people. The right credentials, the right methodology, the right approach. And a man cleaning my floors has done more for my daughter in 2 months than any of it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Seattle was doing its December thing, low sky, gray water, rain that couldn't quite decide how hard to fall. It's not about the credentials, Nolan said. Then, what's it about? She needs to know you're not going anywhere. All the credentials in the world don't fix that. You could have the best nanny on the planet, and it wouldn't matter, because the nannies are the people who prove the point. Blaire frowned. What point? That there's always someone between you and her. Professional buffer. Someone you pay to be there so you don't have to be. He said it as plainly as he'd said everything else, not to wound her, not to score a point, just because it was true and she'd asked. Blaire went very still. I went to her tutoring session last month, she said quietly. I sat in for the first 15 minutes. I know. Wren mentioned it. Blaire looked up. She didn't say a lot, Nolan said. She said you stayed 15 minutes. She said she counted. Something passed across Blaire's face that had nothing professional in it, raw and brief and quickly controlled. She looked away toward the window. After a long moment, I had a call. I'm not judging you. I know you're not. She turned back. That's almost worse. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He had enough sense to know when words would land wrong. Blaire picked up her coffee, set it down again. I'm going to let this go with Dr. Hargrove. But Nolan, she used his first name. She hadn't before, not directly. Going forward, if you see something, you tell me. Before you act. If there's time. If there's time, he agreed. And if there isn't time, I'll use my judgment and tell you after. She almost smiled. Not quite. That's not a reassuring answer. No, but it's the honest one. She nodded once, the kind of nod that closed a topic. Greta said the heating vents are better. They needed cleaning. They'll need proper service in the spring. I'll have her schedule it. Picked up his equipment. She picked up her coffee. They both moved back toward their respective roles in the ordinary machinery of the evening, the way people do after a conversation that's taken something apart and rebuilt it slightly differently than it was before. 3 days later was a Saturday, December 17th, and it was the first evening that something shifted between Blaire Kensington and the uncomfortable truth about what her life had actually looked like for the past several years. She'd gone into Wren's room before bed, something she'd been doing more regularly. Sitting on the edge of the bed for 10 minutes, not much, just enough to mark the end of the day together. Wren had started allowing it. Wasn't yet initiating it, but allowed it, which was progress. That night Wren was drawing. She had a sketch pad on her knees, and she was working on something complicated, a city from an aerial view, all rooftops and water towers, and the angular geometry of buildings from above. Blaire sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. That's remarkable, she said. Wren didn't look up. It's just a drawing. It's a specific view. You can't see this from the ground. How are you? I looked at Google Maps satellite view for reference. Blaire looked at the drawing more carefully. It was Seattle. She could see the bay, the general shape of the downtown grid, but rendered with something more than reproduction. There were details that weren't in any satellite image: a woman on a rooftop, a line of laundry, a child on a fire escape. You added things, Blaire said. Wren shrugged, still drawing. The real version is boring. No people. Just buildings. So you put the people in. Someone has to. Blaire sat there looking at the drawing, and something went through her that was complicated and sad, and also, underneath, something she could only identify as admiration, pure and uncomplicated, the way you admire a thing that's genuinely good and exists completely independent of your feelings about it. Wren, she said, I'm sorry. Wren's pencil slowed. She didn't stop drawing, but she slowed. I know the way things have been hasn't been. Blaire stopped. She'd given 10,000 speeches. She'd spoken to rooms of 300 people without notes. She couldn't find the right structure for this, because there wasn't one. I missed things I shouldn't have missed. Wren was quiet for a moment. Pencil kept moving. Like the 15 minutes. Yes, like the 15 minutes. And before that. Yes. Wren looked up from the drawing. Her expression was guarded, but it was guarded the way a door that's been unlocked is still closed. The mechanism had changed even if the appearance hadn't yet. Are you saying sorry because Nolan said something to you? She asked. No. He said things that helped me think. But this is mine. Wren studied her. Children are remarkably accurate lie detectors with the adults they've known longest. After a moment, she looked back down at the drawing. Okay, she said. Just that. Okay. It was not forgiveness, it was something more like an acknowledgement. A notation in the ledger. They'd returned to it, both of them, many times, in different ways and different moods. That was how it worked between people, especially when the repair was long overdue. But it was something. Blaire stayed for 30 minutes that night. Wren drew, and Blaire watched, and they talked in the quiet and loose way that has nothing to do with agenda and everything to do with simply being in the same place with no requirement to perform. When Blaire finally said goodnight and closed the door, she stood in the hallway for a moment. Down the hall, she could hear the distant sound of Nolan working on the second floor. The familiar rhythm of it water, the mop handle against the floor, the occasional quiet creak of the equipment cart, the sound of someone who'd been there every Monday, Thursday, and Saturday for 2 months. Still there. It was Nolan who noticed the car first. A Thursday in the third week of December, and it was late past 9:30, his work mostly done. Packing up the supply closet and listening to the house settle into its nighttime sounds, which he'd learned the way he always learned environments he occupied regularly. You learned what normal sounded like, so that abnormal registered immediately. He'd gone to the front hall closet to return the long-handled duster, which meant passing the narrow window beside the front door. He glanced out of pure habit, not suspicion, just the reflexive environmental scan that had been part of how he moved through the world for so long that it happened below the level of conscious thought. He stopped. The street in front of the Kensington estate was residential, quiet, lined with old maples that had lost their leaves and stood bare and dripping in the December rain. At this hour on a Thursday, there were exactly 2 cars on the street that he could see, both parked in front of houses, dark, clearly there for the night, and 1 car that was not. A black SUV, parked at the far end of the block, running lights off, but engine running, he could see the faint exhaust plume in the cold air. It was angled slightly, not parallel to the curb the way a parked car would be, but canted outward toward the estate. He watched it for 30 seconds. It didn't move. He went to the kitchen, pulled out his phone, and looked at the time. He walked to the back of the house, to the window above the service entrance, and looked out from a different angle. He couldn't see the SUV from here, but he could see the driveway and the gate and the perimeter wall. And what he saw at the gate made the thing in the base of his spine that he'd spent 14 months trying to quiet go suddenly, completely alert. There was a man at the far edge of the perimeter wall, just a shape in the dark in the rain, barely visible, standing very still in a way that people who are simply passing by do not stand. Nolan stood at the window for 3 seconds. Then he moved. He went upstairs quickly and quietly, the way he'd learned to move through environments where noise was a liability. He knocked on Blaire's office door. She was still working, the light underneath the door giving her away. "Come in." He opened the door. She was at her desk with 2 monitors up and a legal pad covered in notes, and she looked up with the expression of someone being pulled out of deep concentration. "I need you and Ren in the interior hallway on this floor," Nolan said. "Now." Quietly. Blaire stared at him. "What?" "There's a vehicle on the street that's been in the same position for at least 20 minutes. There's someone at the perimeter wall. I don't know yet what it is, but I need you away from the exterior rooms while I figure it out." The competence that had built her company did something that surprised him. It cut straight through the disbelief and hit protocol. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. "Ren is in her room," she said. "Get her. Don't turn on lights in there. Don't go near the windows." "You're serious?" "Yes." She moved. Gave her that she didn't argue, didn't demand an explanation he didn't have time to give, didn't let the strangeness of the situation paralyze her. She crossed the hall in 10 seconds, and he heard her low voice in Ren's room. And then 2 sets of footsteps. And then they were both in the interior hallway, the windowless corridor that ran down the center of the second floor. Ren was in the pajamas, her sketchpad still in her hand, looking at Nolan with an expression that had no fear in it yet, because she was reading his face and he was keeping it steady. He handed Blaire his phone. "I'm going to call 911 from the landline in the kitchen." "I need you to call," he considered. "Do you have a security company?"
"Yes."
"Griffin Security. The number is in my contacts under. Call them. Tell them you may have a perimeter breach. You need a unit now. Give them the address." He looked at Ren. "Stay with your mom. Don't move from this hallway." "What's happening?" Ren asked. "Probably nothing. But I want to make sure." He could see she didn't fully believe the probably nothing. She was too precise a reader of people, but she nodded. He went downstairs. He made the 911 call from the kitchen landline, giving the address and a clear, factual description of what he'd observed: vehicle position, person at the perimeter, current time. The dispatcher asked him to stay on the line. He set the phone on the counter, and while he was doing this, he heard it, the sound of the perimeter gate, not the electronic buzz of the authorized entry system, but the mechanical protest of something being forced. And then voices outside. Low. More than one. Nolan moved to the service entrance door and checked the bolt locked. Solid. A proper deadbolt that he'd noticed weeks ago when he'd started the contract. He moved to the main entrance and checked the front bolt, the chain. He went through the ground floor methodically, every door, every access point, using a mental map of the house he'd built over 2 months of cleaning every inch of it 3 times a week. He killed the kitchen light so the interior went dark. The voices outside had gone quiet, which was worse than hearing them. Quiet meant they'd stopped talking and started moving. He went back to the base of the stairs and stood there in the dark, listening. The house spoke to him the way all spaces speak. When you know them well enough, the creak of a floorboard under pressure, the rattle of a window latch that wasn't rated for real force, the particular sound of a door handle being tested from outside. He heard the handle on the service entrance try. Once. Twice. He stood very still at the bottom of the stairs and breathed and did not let the thing in his chest that was responding to all of this take over the calculation, because the calculation was what mattered. There were 2 of them outside that he'd confirmed. Possibly more. He didn't know what the SUV held. He was in a house with 2 civilians upstairs. He had no weapons and no backup, for however long it took the police to respond, and the 911 dispatcher was still talking to an empty kitchen counter. The service door held. He heard footsteps on gravel, the garden path running along the south side of the house. He was tracking them in his head, mapping their movement against the floor plan he knew, when his phone buzzed upstairs Blaire, on the number he'd given her. He went up fast and silently and took the phone from her in the dark hallway. Griffin said 12 minutes, she said. Her voice was completely controlled. He noted it. In situations like this, the composure of the people around you determined whether things stayed manageable. 12 minutes, he repeated. He looked at Wren. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her sketchpad on her knees, and she was drawing. She was drawing to have something to do with her hands because her hands needed something to do. He almost said something about it. He didn't. Police are already called, he told Blaire. Probably 7 to 10 minutes. Griffin makes it 12. Until then, we stay here and we stay quiet. Who are they? Blaire asked. Her voice had dropped to almost nothing. The people outside. I don't know yet. Guess. He looked at her. Is there anyone who would benefit from leverage over you? Who knows your routine well enough to know a Thursday evening? Something moved across Blaire's face, not surprise, but a rapid, cold assembly of information, the way she must have looked when she was processing a threat to her company. Marcus Terrell, she said, barely audible. Former VP of Infrastructure. I terminated him in October. He filed a wrongful termination claim, but the real issue is the forensic audit. He knows we found evidence of data brokering. He knows what we found. He knows the DOJ referral is pending. Would he use Wren? Her jaw tightened. He'd use anything. Nolan nodded once. Downstairs. Something hit the back door. Not a test this time. A real attempt. Blaire's hand found Wren's shoulder in the dark. Wren looked up from her drawing. Don't stop drawing, Nolan said to her. Wren looked at him. Seriously, keep going. She looked down and kept drawing. Blaire looked at Nolan. In the dark of the hallway, her face was steady and frightened and real, stripped of the careful management she usually carried. She looked like a person instead of a CEO, and he thought it was probably the most honest he'd ever seen her. What do we do? She asked. We wait, Nolan said. And we let them find out that getting through the door is harder than they expected. 3 minutes later, the back door gave up on the service entrance and tried the garage access instead. Solid steel door, commercial grade, self-locking. Nolan had noted it approvingly the first week. 4 minutes after that, red and blue light began strobing through the hallway window at the far end. Then more lights. Then voices official through a loudspeaker, the particular tone that ends certain kinds of evenings. Wren exhaled, just once. A breath she'd been holding for 7 minutes. Okay, Nolan said. Yeah. Her voice was steady, steadier than he expected. I didn't drop my pencil, she said, slightly wondering. My hand didn't even shake. Good hands, Nolan said. She looked at him. You knew we were okay. I hoped we were okay. Different thing. She thought about that. But you would have if they got through. Doesn't matter, because they didn't. Blaire was on her phone already, talking to someone Griffin security, confirming the police presence, her voice back to its full professional register, CEO reassembled like a garment she'd shrugged back on. Efficient and necessary and, he knew now, not the full picture of her. Wren stood up from the floor, sketchpad in hand. She looked at Nolan. She reached over and grabbed his hand. Not in a child's way, not the way a scared kid grabs an adult, reflexively, for comfort. She grabbed his hand deliberately, the way you reach for something you decide to reach for. I knew you'd stay, she said. Simple. Factual. As if she was reporting something she'd observed and was confident in. He looked down at her hand in his. He thought about the first night, the flooded kitchen, the mop, those 4 words he'd said without overthinking them, because they happened to be true. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Downstairs, through the front windows, the police lights swept the wet street in long blue arcs, illuminating the bare maples and the dark houses and the black SUV that was no longer where it had been parked, because it had made a different calculation when the first patrol unit rounded the corner. 3 men were detained at the property perimeter. A 4th was found 2 blocks away. Marcus Tyrell, in a hotel 12 miles from the estate, received a phone call at 9:58 that evening and spent the next 90 seconds sitting on the edge of a king-sized bed before he called his attorney, which was the call that would, in the end, tell investigators everything they needed. Inside the Kensington house on the 2nd floor, in a hallway that still smelled faintly of whatever cleaner Nolan had been using on the floors, the ordinary scent of an ordinary Thursday, that had become something else. 3 people stood in the dark and the receding adrenaline and the blue-tinted light, waiting for the moment when they could call the evening done. Wren had her hand in Nolan's. She didn't let go for a long time. The police were at the estate until past midnight. There were 2 detectives, 4 patrol officers, a representative from Griffin Security, who arrived 20 minutes after the fact and spent most of his time looking professionally embarrassed, and eventually a federal investigator named Castillo, who showed up at 11:15 with a laptop bag and the particular economy of movement that told Nolan immediately he was someone who'd spent time in operational environments before moving to a desk. Castillo looked at Nolan the way people sometimes looked at him when they'd gotten the full picture of the evening, the secured doors, the perimeter assessment, tactical patience of waiting rather than engaging, and said, simply, "What's your background?" "Navy," Nolan said. Castillo nodded once, the specific nod of someone who didn't need the details spelled out. "Good read on the situation." "They weren't professionals," Nolan said. "They made noise. Hired muscle. Tyrell wasn't running an operation, he was throwing money at a problem." Castillo closed his laptop bag. Problem being that your employer had enough encrypted evidence to end his career and possibly his freedom. And he'd been watching the house for about 2 weeks trying to find a window. He picked the wrong window. He did. Castillo looked at him for a moment longer. "We may need a statement from you. Formal one, at the field office." "That's fine." Blaire had given her own statement in the library, sitting across from one of the detectives, with her hands folded on the reading table, walking through the history of Marcus Tyrrell's termination, the forensic audit, the DOJ referral, with the precision and composure of someone who had been prepared for a version of this conversation for weeks. She'd known something was coming. She'd had her legal team on standby. She had not anticipated it, arriving at her home on a Thursday evening while her daughter was drawing in the upstairs hallway. But she was Blaire Kensington, and she did not let unprepared for things show on her face while strangers were in the room. Wren had given a brief statement, with Blaire beside her, about what she'd observed from the hallway. She answered the detective's questions directly and without embellishment, and when the detective thanked her for being calm and clear, she said, "I was drawing," as if that explained it, and it more or less did. After everyone left, the house went very quiet. It was 12:40 in the morning. Wren should have been asleep hours ago. Blaire stood in the kitchen making tea she didn't want, because she needed something to do with her hands, and Wren sat at the kitchen island in her pajamas with her sketch pad, and Nolan was still there because no one had told him to go, and he hadn't decided to yet. "You should sleep," Blaire said to Wren. "I'm not tired." "You're 8. I know how old I am." Blaire put the kettle on. She turned and looked at her daughter, rumpled and dark-eyed and wide awake, and entirely herself, sketch pad open, pencil moving. She looked at Nolan, who was leaning against the counter with his arms folded, watching the room with the specific quality of attention he had that most people didn't present, but not intrusive, watchful without making you feel watched. "He was a SEAL," Wren said to Blaire, without looking up from the sketch pad. Blaire glanced at Nolan. "Caleb told me," Wren added, "weeks ago." "I figured you knew," Blaire said. "Did you know?" Blaire was quiet for a moment. "I suspected." "After tonight, I'm certain." Wren looked up at Nolan. "Why didn't you say so? It didn't come up." "You're the janitor who used to be a Navy SEAL," Wren said. "That seems like something that would come up." "I'm not the janitor who used to be a SEAL. I'm the janitor. I also used to be a SEAL. Those are 2 separate things." Wren looked at him for a long moment. "That's the most words you've said about yourself all at once." "It's late. My guard is down." She almost smiled. She went back to the sketch pad. Kettle started. Blaire poured water over a tea bag she didn't want and stood there holding the mug, and the ordinary act of it, the warmth in her hands, the small cloud of steam, the familiar domestic ritual, did something to the tension she'd been holding for the past 3 hours. Not resolved it, but acknowledged it, gave it a shape she could carry. "Thank you," she said to Nolan. "I don't think I said it clearly enough, in all of that. So, thank you. You don't need to. I know I don't need to. I'm doing it anyway." She looked at him directly. "You kept my daughter safe. I kept the doors locked and called the police." "Don't do that either," she said. The same thing she'd said to him weeks ago, "Don't be diplomatic." And like then, there was a quality to her voice that cut through the deflection, something that had nothing managed about it. He didn't deflect again. "You're welcome," he said. Wren looked up from the sketch pad. "I'm keeping this," she said, holding it up. On the page was a drawing quick, rough, the lines not polished of the three of them in the hallway. Herself on the floor, back against the wall. Blaire beside her, upright, hand on her shoulder. And Nolan, standing turned slightly toward the staircase. She'd been drawing them while it was happening. Blaire looked at it for a long time. "Yeah," she said finally. "You keep that one." The aftermath of the Tyrell incident unwound over the following weeks, in the way that legal and investigative processes unwind slowly, in pieces, with a lot of waiting between developments. Marcus Tyrell was formally arrested in January. The charges covered a range that his attorney was going to have a difficult time navigating: conspiracy, witness tampering, and 2 counts related to the data brokering scheme that had triggered his termination in October. The encrypted evidence Blaire's forensic team had compiled turned out to be more comprehensive than even her legal team had fully understood. And when Castillo's office combined it with what the 4 men at the perimeter had eventually agreed to share in exchange for considerations, the picture that emerged was thorough and ugly. Company's board called an emergency meeting in January. Blaire sat at the head of the conference table and walked them through everything: the audit findings, the DOJ referral, the incident at the house, the timeline with the specific controlled clarity she brought to every crisis, which was to say she was completely in command, and the room knew it. What the room did not know was that she'd sat in her car in the parking garage for 7 minutes before coming up, because her hands had been shaking not from fear, not from the morning's coffee, but from something she couldn't name cleanly: the accumulated weight, maybe, of the preceding months. The distance between what her life looked like from the outside and what it had actually been. Specific loneliness of being the most competent person in every room for long enough that you stopped noticing it was lonely. She went upstairs and ran the meeting perfectly. She sat in the parking garage first. That felt important somehow. That both things were true. In the weeks after the incident, something changed in the Kensington house, and the change was different from the gradual shift that had been happening since October. Those had been slow and tentative, 2 steps forward and 1 sideways, and occasionally 1 back. This was more sudden, not dramatic, not a single scene of revelation, but a compression. Like the events of that Thursday had taken a long, slow process and pushed it forward 6 months in 1 night. Blaire stopped treating her evenings as extension of the workday. This sounds like a simple thing. It was not a simple thing. She had organized her life around the principle that the work was always there and always needed more, and that principle had served her in concrete, measurable ways for 12 years. Abandoning it or even adjusting it required dismantling something structural, not just a habit but an identity. She didn't dismantle it all at once. She did it the way Nolan did things, methodically, 1 specific piece at a time. She told her executive assistant, Priya, that she was not available for calls after 7 on weekdays. Priya received this information with admirable professionalism and then spent the rest of the afternoon quietly reshuffling 6 months of established patterns. She stopped doing weekend morning calls. Saturday mornings, specifically, became a protected block of time that she described in her calendar simply as home, which Priya understood meant do not touch, and which Blaire understood meant figure out how to be in the house with her daughter without an agenda. The first few Saturday mornings were uncomfortable in the specific way that unstructured time is uncomfortable when you've spent years structuring everything. She didn't know what to do. Ren didn't know what to do with her, not knowing what to do. They circled each other a bit, and Blaire made coffee wrong twice because she usually had Greta do it, and Ren watched her do it wrong without saying anything, which was its own form of mercy. The third Saturday, Ren said, "Do you actually know how to make pancakes?" "I know the concept." "That's not the same thing." "I know that." Ren got down from her stool. She went to the pantry and came back with flour and baking powder and syrup, and she stood at the counter and said, "I watched a video and they made pancakes together, badly, in the way that people make things when neither of them actually knows what they're doing, and they're both pretending confidence they don't have." The first batch burned. Ren looked at the pan. "We need to turn the heat down." "I thought high heat was..." The video said medium. "You went high." "I thought it would be faster." "Faster doesn't mean better." She looked at her mother with an expression that was dry and 8 years old, and also somehow ancient. "You know that, right?" Blaire looked at her daughter. "I'm learning," she said. The second batch was better. Not good uneven, a little dense, the kind of pancakes that would embarrass anyone with actual cooking ability, but better. They ate them at the kitchen island with too much syrup, and Wren talked about a book she was reading about birds, and Blaire listened. Actually listened, the way she'd learned to listen in the past few months, with her phone face down and her attention fully in the room. Outside, December had given way to January, and Seattle was doing its gray and dripping thing, and the kitchen was warm and smelled like burnt edges and syrup. And it was the kind of morning that wouldn't appear in any quarterly report or balance sheet or measure of Blaire Kensington's success. It was the kind that would show up, years later, as the thing she remembered when she tried to pinpoint when things got better. Nolan came on Monday, Thursday, and Saturday, as he always had. The dynamic had shifted after the incident, the way dynamics always shift after people see each other clearly under pressure. Blaire no longer treated his presence as she'd initially treated it, as a service she'd purchased from a vendor, efficient but bounded. And Nolan no longer moved through the house with quite the careful neutrality of a man who understood exactly where his role ended and was disciplined about staying inside it. He still cleaned the house. He was still technically the maintenance contractor. But some of the formality had come loose at the edges, the way it does when people have been through something together, and the shared experience makes strict role-playing feel artificial. He started eating dinner with them, sometimes, on Thursday evenings. Not because anyone invited him formally, it happened incrementally. The first time, Blaire had been putting food on the table when he was finishing up the kitchen, and she'd said, without ceremony, there's enough, and he'd washed his hands and sat down, and that was that. The second time, Wren had set 3 places before Blaire thought to, which told Nolan everything he needed to know about how the arrangement had been received. He brought Caleb on 2 of those Thursday evenings. The first time, Caleb arrived with a library book about deep-sea submarines. He'd moved on from regular submarines into the specialized territory of deep-sea research vessels, which his teacher had encouraged as evidence of intellectual passion, and which Nolan suspected was just Caleb's version of going down a rabbit hole that felt bottomless and therefore satisfying. He sat beside Wren at the table, and they argued immediately and comprehensively about whether space exploration or ocean exploration was more important. A debate that had no resolution, but occupied 45 minutes, with the specific intensity that children bring to things they actually care about. Blaire sat at the end of the table and watched them argue, and found herself thinking about things she hadn't thought about in a long time. About what it looked like when a house had people in it who weren't performing anything. About how much of her life, for how many years, had been performance not dishonestly, not cynically, but performance in the sense that every room she walked into required a version of herself that was calibrated to the room. The boardroom version, the interview version, the crisis version, perfect mother version she'd been attempting and failing for 6 months. She looked at her daughter, gesturing with a fork, making some point about bioluminescent fish, with the conviction of someone stating settled science, and at Caleb across from her gesturing back with equal conviction, and at Nolan at the other end of the table, eating and listening, and occasionally adding something that derailed both of them into new territory. She looked at the kitchen, the counters she'd eaten at alone for 2 years, the island where she'd read quarterly reports over coffee at 6 in the morning, in a house that technically had people in it, but practically felt empty. She thought about her mother's handwriting on the library labels. She thought about what her mother had said to her. Years ago, when the company was 18 months old and Blaire hadn't slept properly in 6 weeks. You're building something, yes, but make sure it doesn't build a wall around everything else while you're not paying attention. She'd filed that somewhere and not retrieved it until now. The fork debate resolved itself the way children's debates often resolve, not with a winner, but with a mutual pivot to an adjacent subject. And Wren asked Caleb whether he'd ever been to the aquarium, and Caleb said no. And Wren looked at Blaire with the specific look that wasn't quite asking but was. We could go, Blaire said. Wren tried not to react too visibly to this. She did not entirely succeed. When? Saturday? If Nolan's okay with Caleb coming. She said it addressing Wren, but looked at Nolan. And Nolan looked at Caleb, who had gone very still in the way of a child, trying not to seem too interested in something in case it doesn't work out. Fine with me, Nolan said. Caleb went back to his food with the elaborate casualness of someone who was very pleased, but had decided to play it cool, a social strategy that was entirely transparent to every adult at the table, and which no one commented on. Wren, who was not playing it cool, pulled the sketch pad onto her lap under the table and started drawing. They went to the aquarium on a Saturday in late January. It was the kind of day that announced itself as ordinary from the stark gray sky, light drizzle, the aquarium not particularly crowded on a January weekend. They drove in Blaire's car, which was substantially more comfortable than Nolan's Silverado, and which Caleb examined with the frank appraisal of a 7-year-old who had no reason to pretend not to notice things. "Your car smells like coffee," he told Blaire. "I drink a lot of coffee. My dad says too much coffee makes you mean. Your dad is probably right." "Are you mean sometimes?" Blaire said. "I'm working on it." Caleb considered this, apparently found it satisfactory, and went back to looking out the window. Nolan, in the passenger seat, kept his face neutral. Blaire caught the controlled amusement in his jaw and looked back at the road. The aquarium was Caleb's element in a way that was immediate and complete. Within 30 seconds of entering the jellyfish gallery, he had identified 3 species by name, and within 5 minutes, he had corrected a placard's description of moon jellies with the specific gentle certainty of a child who is accustomed to being more informed about this than the adults around him. Wren walked beside him. She was usually the most knowledgeable person in a room about whatever interested her, her drawings, her maps, the structural logic of things, and she received Caleb's jellyfish knowledge with the respectful attention of someone who understood what it felt like to know something deeply and wanted to honor that in someone else. They stopped in front of the large tank, the central floor-to-ceiling display, a kelp forest with leopard sharks moving through the slow green light. Nolan stood beside Blaire, slightly back from where the kids had their faces near the glass. He could talk about this for 4 hours, Nolan said. Wren would listen for all 4, Blaire said. They watched the kids for a moment. Caleb was pointing at something near the base of the tank, explaining to Wren, who was nodding and watching where he pointed. She never had a friend, Blaire said. Quiet, not performing regret, just stating it. Not a real one. Plenty of kids who wanted to be close to her because of the house or because their parents wanted the connection. But not a real one. She's got one now, Nolan said. Blaire looked at him sideways. He was watching the tank, the slow drift of kelp, the sharks going about the business of being sharks with magnificent indifference to the observers. You know what I keep thinking about? Blaire said. What? That drawing. The one she did in the hallway. During all of it. Yeah, she drew all 3 of us. She had it in her head as the 3 of us. Blaire looked back at the kids. Not me and her. Not her alone. 3 Nolan didn't say anything to that. I don't know what to do with that, Blaire said. You don't have to do anything with it. What she drew. She's 8. She drew what felt true. He looked at her then. She was watching her daughter describe something to Caleb the kids had reversed. Now Wren explaining something, pointing at a different part of the tank, and her expression had that quality he'd seen in the library weeks ago, unguarded version of her face, the one that existed when she wasn't managing anything. You're good at this, he said. She blinked. At what? Being here. When you let yourself, she laughed short, a little wry. That's a very specific compliment. It's the accurate one. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back, and there was a beat between them that landed differently than the beats that had come before, not the professional acknowledgement, not the careful mutual respect of 2 people navigating unusual circumstances. Something with more weight to it. Something that had been accumulating in the background, in all the Thursday evenings and library conversations and pancake mornings, and had found a moment of stillness in which to make itself apparent. Neither of them did anything about it. The kids came back, Caleb pulling at Nolan's sleeve to come see the wolf eel, which he pronounced the ugliest and therefore most interesting creature in the building, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary motion of the afternoon. But it had happened. Both of them knew it had happened. Blaire offered Nolan a different role in February. She did it in the library, because that had become the room where their real conversations happened. Something about the books and the 2 kinds of handwriting, and the winter light through the window, made it a room for saying things you actually meant. She'd spent 2 weeks thinking about how to frame it, which was unusual for her. She didn't usually need 2 weeks. She usually saw the shape of a thing and moved. I want to offer you a position, she said. Proper employment. Head of residential security for the estate. He looked at her steadily. The salary would be... She started. No, he said. She stopped. You haven't heard the number. I don't need to. It's a significant step up from Blaire. Her name. He used it the same way she'd used his weeks ago, a small, deliberate thing that shifted the register of the conversation. No. She studied him. Explain it to me. He thought about how to say it. If I'm on your payroll as the head of security, I'm solving your problem for you. Problem isn't security. You've got Griffin for that. Griffin wasn't here that night. You were. I was here because I clean your floors 3 nights a week. That's a different thing. It's the result that matters. The result that matters, Nolan said, is Wren. And Wren doesn't need a paid security consultant who lives in the house. She needs a parent. She's getting one. He held her gaze. You don't need me to do that. You're doing it. Blaire was quiet for a moment. Outside, Seattle was doing its February thing, which looked exactly like its January and December things, but felt marginally less dark. You're worried about replacing her father, Blaire said. I don't want her to depend on me to fix something that you're already fixing. That's not quite the same answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at him. What is the same answer? He was quiet for a moment. She doesn't need me to stay, because you're paying me to. She needs to know I'm staying because I want to. The library was very still. The heating vent ticked. Somewhere in the house, Wren was moving around the floorboards told on her. The way the house's particular creaks and settlings had told Nolan where everyone was for months. And do you? Blaire asked. Her voice was level, asking a real question, not a rhetorical one. Want to? He looked at her for a long time. Yeah, he said. I do. She held his gaze. Something shifted in her expression, not the unguarded flash she sometimes allowed, but something more deliberate, more considered. The way she looked when she'd thought something through fully and arrived at a position she was prepared to hold. Then stay, she said. But on your own terms, I will. And for the record, she added, I'm not asking you to replace anyone. I'm not asking you to be anything you're not. She paused. I'm just asking you to keep doing what you've been doing. Which is showing up, she said simply. He nodded. He could do. That, in fact, he'd already been doing and planned to continue doing, regardless of what they called it or what it paid. The 3 months following the incident did what time does when the structures holding things in place have been loosened. They allowed things to rearrange into shapes that made more sense. Wren changed. Not completely, not in a straight line. She still had bad days and difficult evenings and moments where the old armor went back up with the speed of long practice. She still sometimes tested people, still sometimes got quiet when things felt too close, still occasionally did something to create distance when the absence of distance made her nervous. But the frequency changed, and the character of it changed. She stopped trying to make Nolan leave. Not because she'd decided he was permanent. She hadn't let herself think in those terms yet, which was sensible, but because the hypothesis that everyone left had begun to accumulate contradicting evidence, and Wren was, at her core, someone who updated her beliefs when the evidence required it. He kept showing up, Monday, Thursday, Saturday, through February and into March, through a difficult week when Wren failed a math test and came home in the specific humiliation of a child who is used to being competent and found it intolerable, through a birthday that Blaire had restructured entirely at the last minute to be smaller and quieter, and at home rather than the elaborate catered event she'd booked months earlier, Wren had said, carefully, and once, that she'd rather have people she actually liked there, and Blaire had heard it and acted on it. The birthday had 6 people. Wren and Caleb and Nolan and Blaire. Greta, who had been in the house long enough to be family in the way that long-term household staff sometimes become, and a girl from Wren's class named Priscilla, who was quiet and strange about birds, in the same way Caleb was strange about submarines, and whom Wren had started eating lunch with in November. They had burnt-edge cake. Blaire and Wren had made it themselves, with the same applied incompetence they brought to the pancakes, and Caleb ate 3 pieces and pronounced the burnt parts the best parts, which Wren said was objectively wrong, which Caleb said was objectively right. And Priscilla looked at both of them and said quietly that she preferred the middle, which somehow broke the argument into laughter. Nolan watched the table from his end and thought about Caleb at home in Tacoma a year ago, eating cereal alone in the kitchen because Mrs. Petrakis had a family thing, and there'd been no one else, and how his son had been so careful about asking for things because he'd already understood, at 7, that some things couldn't just be asked for. He thought about the drawing on Caleb's kitchen table, the 4 figures. The dark-haired girl with crossed arms who was meant to be friendly. He looked at that girl now 8, turning 9, hair still loose and tangled because she'd said she didn't want to do anything with it for her birthday, sitting at her own table in her own house eating cake she'd made herself, talking to two children who liked her for nothing more than who she was. He thought, sometimes the thing you can't ask for just shows up anyway. He didn't say it out loud. It was the kind of thought that didn't need saying. In March, Blaire made the decision she'd been circling for 2 months. She called her COO, a woman named Dev Krishnamurthy, who had been running the operational side of the company for 4 years, with the competence of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, and she told Dev that she was restructuring her role, not stepping down, staying, but stepping back from daily operational control, keeping strategy, keeping the board relationships, keeping the partnerships that required her specifically, giving Dev the rest. Dev received this information with the specific quality of someone who had been expecting it for longer than Blaire realized. Are you sure? Dev asked. Yes. Because the last time you restructured, different. You pulled it back in 6 weeks. I know, Blaire said. This time I have a reason not to. Dev was quiet for a moment. Ren. Yes. Another pause. Then, okay. Let's do it right. They spent 3 weeks working out the structure. Blaire's evenings became genuinely hers. Her Saturdays held. She stopped checking her phone during dinner, not because she forced herself, but because there was less to check and more reason not to. She was not a perfect mother. She would not have described herself that way, and Ren would not have either, and they both knew it, and had stopped expecting perfection to be the standard. What she was by March was present. Consistently, imperfectly, sometimes awkwardly, occasionally frustratingly present. Ren noticed. She noticed the way children notice things that matter not by commenting on them, but by adjusting. By setting 3 places for dinner without being asked. By waiting in the kitchen on Saturday mornings instead of sleeping until noon. By bringing her drawings to the table and showing them without waiting for her mother to ask. She still showed them to Nolan first, sometimes. Blaire had made her peace with that. The drawing of the 3 of them in the hallway went up on Ren's bedroom wall, pinned, without a frame, in the upper left corner, where she could see it from the bed. Below it, over the following weeks, more things went up. A drawing of Caleb reading his submarine book, rendered with the specificity of someone who'd studied the subject. A drawing of the aquarium tank, the kelp forest, the leopard sharks. A drawing of the kitchen on a Saturday morning. 2 figures at the counter, a pan on the stove, flour on the counter. A drawing of the library, with 2 handwriting labels on a book spine visible in the detail. A drawing of the dock behind the estate, empty in winter light. And, in the corner, added later, in pencil, a small figure sitting at the end of the dock, looking out at the water. The small figure had a frayed patch on the shoulder of his jacket. Ren had caught the fraying stitching on his uniform. She'd remembered it. She'd put it in the drawing. That was how you knew what mattered to her. You looked at what she chose to put in the frame, what she decided deserved to be kept. Nolan told Caleb about Blaire in the way that single parents tell their children about things not with a formal announcement, but in the ordinary fabric of conversation, in the car on the way somewhere, which is where the real talks always happened. You like her, Caleb said. He said it the way he said things about submarines as a factual observation, not a judgment. Yeah, Nolan said. I do. Does she like you? I think so. Caleb looked out the passenger window at the February street going by. Is it weird? Because she has a lot of money and you clean her floors. Nolan thought about it. It was weird at first. It's less weird now. Why? Because we stopped thinking about it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Is Ren going to be my sister? That's a long way from where we are. But maybe? Nolan looked at his son sideways. Maybe. Someday. We're not there yet. Caleb nodded. Processed. I'd be okay with that, he said, and went back to looking out the window with the air of someone who had weighed a thing and found it acceptable, which was Caleb's version of enthusiasm. Good, Nolan said. She argues a lot, Caleb said. Yeah. So do I know. We argue well together, though. He said it with genuine assessment. Like we're arguing about the right stuff. Nolan drove. Outside Tacoma in February was wet and gray, and lit by the specific pale light of a city that had made its peace with never quite having sunshine, and the Silverado's heater was finally, after 2 winters, working properly, because Nolan had fixed it himself one weekend in November. She's going to be okay, Caleb said. Ren? Yeah. She was pretty scared. At that house, she was. Nolan agreed. She handled it well. She kept drawing, yeah. That's what you do, Caleb said. When you're scared, you do the thing you do best. So you remember you know how to do things. He looked at his dad. You taught me that. Nolan kept his eyes on the road. He didn't remember teaching Caleb that specifically. But he supposed that was how it worked. The things you did in front of your children were teaching, whether you named them or not. Yeah, he said. That's the idea. Caleb went back to his window. The Silverado moved through the wet February streets, and the heater worked. And somewhere across the city, in a large house that had stopped feeling empty, a girl pinned a drawing to her bedroom wall and stepped back to look at it. And what she felt when she looked at it was something she didn't have a word for yet, but would, eventually. The word was safe. Not safe in the sense of no danger. She knew by now that danger was part of the world and didn't always announce itself. Safe in the way that mattered more than that. The knowledge that whatever came, she would not be facing it alone. And not because she'd been lucky enough to find people who were professionally obligated to stay, but because she'd been found by people who chose to. She turned off the light. She got into bed under the covers. Outside, Seattle did its Seattle thing, rain on the window, the distant sound of water, the particular gray grace of a city that had stopped apologizing for its weather and simply existed inside it. She looked at the drawings on her wall. She closed her eyes. She slept without waking until morning, which was something she hadn't done reliably in 3 years, and which Blaire noticed and did not comment on, because some things are better honored by silence and by the simple act of being there when the morning comes. Spring arrived the way it always did in Seattle, not dramatically, not with the sudden warmth that people in other cities took for granted, but gradually, apologetically, as if the city wasn't quite sure it had permission. The rain got softer. The light lasted a little longer each evening. The maples on the street in front of the Kensington estate started putting out leaves, tentative green against the gray sky, and Wren drew them from her bedroom window on a Saturday morning while Blaire made coffee downstairs and got it right for the first time without assistance. Some changes announce themselves. Most don't. Most just accumulate, the way the light accumulated through March and April incrementally, below the threshold of daily notice, until one morning you look up and realize the world is different from what it was, and you can't identify the exact moment it changed because there wasn't one. Nolan was still coming 3 nights a week. The maintenance contract was still technically in place. Greta renewed it every 3 months when, with the methodical competence she brought to everything but the nature of what it covered had drifted, considerably from the original 4-page protocol document. He cleaned the house, yes. He also fixed things that needed fixing, because he noticed them, and it was faster to fix them than to schedule someone else to, and because the house had been somewhat neglected in the years when Blaire was running it from a distance, and it needed more than occasional maintenance. It needed someone paying attention to it. He paid attention to it. He also ate dinner there twice a week now. He brought Caleb on Thursdays when school and Mrs. Petrakis' schedule aligned. He sat in the library sometimes. After his work was done, reading while Blaire finished whatever she needed to finish, and Wren drew at the other end of the room. And nobody said anything about how comfortable the silence had become, because saying it would have made it self-conscious, and it worked better when it was just the thing that happened. Caleb had started a new book series, science fiction, a 12-volume thing about deep space research vessels, which had connected his submarine obsession to his emerging astronomy obsession in a way that satisfied him deeply, and worried his teacher slightly, who felt he should be reading things with more human characters. Nolan had read the first 3 volumes himself on Mrs. Petrakis' suggestion, so that he could talk to his son about them. He was not naturally a science fiction reader. He got through them and understood why Caleb loved them, the loneliness of the protagonists, the vast dark spaces, the small crews of people who had only each other. He understood more than he told Caleb he understood. Wren and Caleb had stopped arguing about space versus ocean exploration, not because one of them had conceded, but because they'd arrived at a détente. The ocean was the space that was actually accessible, and therefore pragmatically superior. Space was the long game, and the best outcome was that Caleb went into oceanographic research, and Wren designed the cities that would eventually make the long game possible. This agreement had been worked out over 3 Thursdays and a Saturday aquarium trip, and was, as far as either of them was concerned, settled. They were, by any reasonable measure, best friends. This was a word Wren had not used in reference to another person in years, and she'd used it once, carefully, in conversation with Blaire, watching her mother's face to see how she received it. Blaire had received it exactly right, not making too much of it, not performing delight, just nodding and saying that Caleb had good taste, which made Wren snort and go back to her drawing. Small victories. The kind that don't look like victories at all until you're standing far enough back to see the whole picture. Nolan started his company in April. Not dramatically. Not with an office launch or a business plan presentation or any of the machinery that people associate with starting something. He started it the way he did most things, with a specific problem he could see and a concrete approach to solving it. Problem was simple. There were a lot of men and women leaving military service every year and struggling to translate what they knew into civilian employment. Not because they lacked competence, most of them had more operational competence in specific domains than their civilian counterparts could conceive of, but because competence and credential were not the same thing, and the civilian world ran on credential. Could have spent 8 years making high-stakes security decisions under pressure in environments that would break most people. And a hiring manager would look at your resume and see a gap where a certification should be. Nolan had been living inside that problem for 14 months. He also, after December, had a particular set of relationships and a particular reputation in a particular sector of Seattle that he hadn't had before. Dio from the federal office had called him twice in January, once for the formal statement, once for something more informal, a conversation about security assessment methodology that had lasted 90 minutes and ended with Stizio saying, "With the economy of a man who didn't waste words, you should be doing this professionally." Blaire had said the same thing, in her own way, with the live-in offer he'd turned down. Turned down that offer. He didn't turn down the idea. He called it Rourke Protective Solutions, which was not a creative name, but it was clear, and Nolan didn't have the patience for branding that obscured what a thing actually was. The company did security consulting and assessment, evaluating residential and commercial security setups, identifying vulnerabilities, advising on protocols, and it employed, from the start, former service members who were looking for the bridge he hadn't had. He started with 3 people, a former Marine named Tess, who had done 2 tours in communications and security, and was currently working nights at a hospital parking lot, a former Army Ranger named Devlin, who was Tacoma local and had been doing warehouse work for 6 months and spending his weekends irritated about it, and a woman named Yoon, who had left the Air Force after 10 years and had a security background that was substantially more sophisticated than anything Nolan had on paper, but who'd been unable to get hired because she'd taken 18 months to care for her mother after the service, and the gap had raised questions. He told all 3 of them the same thing at the first meeting, which happened in his kitchen in Tacoma over coffee, because he didn't have an office yet. This isn't charity. I need people who are good at this. You're good at this. We're going to build something that makes that legible to clients who don't know how to read your resume. Tess had asked how he was going to get clients. "I've got a starting point," he said. Starting point was a referral from Castillo, who had several colleagues in the federal system who needed assessments done on residential and light commercial properties, and who trusted Nolan's judgment enough to put his name forward. From that referral came 3 contracts in April. From those contracts came 2 more referrals in May. The work was not glamorous. It was methodical assessment, thorough documentation, clear recommendations, and it paid steadily. Blaire did not fund it. He was specific about that, not because he was too proud to accept help, but because he'd thought it through and understood that the company needed to stand on what it actually was, not on borrowed credibility. He told her this directly, in the library, the same way he told her most things. "I know," she said. "I wasn't going to offer again." "I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway. For clarity. For clarity." She looked at him with the half-smile she'd started allowing more frequently not performed. Just the thing her face did when she found something genuinely wry. "You know you're very annoying to argue with. I've been told." "By who, Wren?" he said. "Mainly Wren." She laughed. It was a full one. Not managed. And it changed her face entirely the way full laughter does, took away the careful composure, and left just a person finding something funny, which was the best version of anyone. He looked at her while she was laughing. She caught him looking and stopped, not self-conscious exactly, but aware. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You should do that more." She looked at him for a moment. "Yeah." She considered this. "I used to, before things got complicated. Things are still complicated." "Yes," she agreed, "but differently." He nodded. Outside, the April evening was doing its tentative spring thing, the last light catching the water in the distance, and the library was warm and quiet and smelled like it always did. and neither of them moved for a moment, and the space between them had the particular quality of something that's been held very carefully for a long time and is ready now to be set down differently. Nolan, she said. Yeah, I'm not good at this part, she said. Direct, the way she was always direct when she'd thought something through. I haven't been good at this for a long time. I want you to know that going in, because I think you deserve to know what you're working with. I know what I'm working with, he said. You know the parts I've shown you. That's usually the case with people. She held his gaze. I'm serious, so am I. He leaned forward slightly. You're not the only one who hasn't been good at this. I've been in the same house for 6 months, and I've been careful the whole time about something that stopped needing to be careful about a while ago. She looked at him. Why? Because it was your house and I was the janitor. You're not just the janitor. You said that, he said, the first week. I've been saying it ever since. Yeah, he said. I heard it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, okay, just that. Okay. The way Wren had said it to her in November, not as acceptance of everything, not as a resolution of all uncertainty, but as an acknowledgement, a notation, a beginning, he said. Told Wren in May. Not with a formal announcement, there was no sitting her down, no careful script, because both of them knew Wren well enough by that point to know that formal announcements made her defensive and scripts made her feel managed, and the last thing either of them wanted was for this to feel like something being done to her rather than something happening around her that she was part of. It happened on a Thursday evening, after dinner, when Wren came into the living room to find them sitting on the same couch rather than at opposite ends of the room, which was where they'd been defaulting for the past several months, and Nolan's hand was resting on the cushion between them in a way that wasn't quite holding her mother's hand, but was close to it. Wren stood in the doorway. She looked at the couch. She looked at Nolan. She looked at Blaire. Okay, she said. Blaire blinked. That's it? What did you want me to say? I don't know. Something. Wren looked at the couch situation again, with the deliberate assessment of someone confirming a hypothesis they'd been running for a while. I figured it out in January, she said, at the aquarium. You were looking at each other, weird by the jellyfish. Blaire looked at Nolan. Nolan looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man who was not going to comment. And you're okay with it? Blaire said. Wren seemed to think about what she actually felt, which was a thing she'd gotten better at the gap between the reflexive answer and the true one. Yeah, she said, I think so. It's a little weird. That's fair. But weird is okay. She looked at Nolan. You're not trying to be my dad. No, he said. Good. I don't need that. I know. She thought for another moment. What do I call you? Nolan, he said. Same as always. She nodded, like this was the right answer. Then, is Caleb going to be around more? Probably. Good. She turned to go back to her room, then stopped in the doorway. The pancakes will need to improve, she said, addressing this to her mother. People are going to be here more. You can't keep burning the edges. The edges aren't that bad, Blaire said. They really are, Wren and Nolan said, simultaneously. Wren pointed at Nolan with the vindicated expression of someone whose position had just been validated. She walked back upstairs. Blaire looked at the ceiling. Nolan took her hand properly off the cushion. She let him. The Tyrell case resolved in June. He took a plea. In the end, the way people take pleas when the evidence is comprehensive, and the alternative is a trial that will be worse. The charges he pled to carried meaningful consequences, 3 years, reduced from 7, with a full civil judgment that addressed what his scheme had cost the company and the people whose data he'd brokered. Blaire was in the courthouse for the sentencing. She sat in the gallery behind the prosecution's table, with her hands folded in her lap, and her face doing the careful thing it did in rooms where she couldn't afford to show everything she felt. She watched Tyrell stand before the judge. She listened to the sentence. She watched him be let out. She felt less than she'd expected to feel. Not relief implied you'd been holding something, and she'd largely processed the anger months earlier. In the way she processed most things, work it through, move forward, don't let it occupy more space than it deserves. What she felt, mostly, was tired, and underneath the tired, something quieter, the particular exhaustion of having carried something heavy for a long time and being allowed to set it down. Called Nolan from the parking garage. It's done, she said. How do you feel? Tired, she said. Okay, mostly tired. Go home, he said.
I have a 4 o'clock.
Go home, he said again. Not an instruction, not a command. Just a thing said plainly by someone who knew what she needed better than she was currently allowing herself to know it. She went home. Wren was there, school had let out at 3, and she was in the kitchen doing homework, which she did at the kitchen island, now instead of alone in her study room, because the kitchen felt less like a room you were sent to and more like a room you chose. She looked up when Blaire came in. "Courthouse?" she said. "Yeah." "Is it over?" "Yes." Wren looked at her mother for a moment with those precise reading eyes. "You look tired." "I am tired. Sit down," Wren said. She got up and went to the cabinet and got 2 glasses and filled them both with water and set one in front of Blaire and took the other back to her homework. And it was such a small thing, 2 glasses of water. A child noticing, a mother sitting down, that Blaire almost said something about it. She didn't. Some things were better when they weren't narrated. She sat at the island and drank the water and watched her daughter do homework. And the house was warm, and the evening light was coming through the kitchen windows in the long, golden way of a June evening in the Northwest, and Blaire Kensington, who had spent 12 years building something measurable and impressive and real, understood in that unremarkable kitchen moment that she had also, somehow, in the mess and the difficulty of the past 8 months, built something she hadn't known she was missing. She hadn't built it alone. That was the part she'd needed to learn. They got married in September. Not a large wedding, neither of them wanted that. Blaire had done the large wedding once, the first time, and it had cost $60,000 and produced photographs in which she and her ex-husband looked beautiful and correct and had nothing to do with the people they actually were. She had no desire to repeat the experience. What they did instead was this. A Saturday afternoon, the dock behind the estate, 14 people, a judge who was a friend of Castillo's and owed him a favor, and an evening that ran long because no one particularly wanted to leave. The 14 people were Greta, who cried from the moment the ceremony started and showed no signs of stopping. Castillo, who did not cry and would have denied it if anyone claimed he did. Dev Krishnamurthy, who had become something close to a genuine friend over the course of the year, and who gave a toast that was 11 minutes long and contained 2 genuinely funny stories Blaire had forgotten she'd told her. Tess and Devlin and Yoon from the company. Mrs. Petrakis from Tacoma, who brought food nobody had asked her to bring, which was exactly right. Priscilla, Wren's friend, who arrived with a bird drawn on her sneakers and sat beside Wren through the whole thing. And 3 people Blaire had known long enough that they qualified as chosen family, the kind you accumulate over years of working alongside someone and realizing that the person, not the work, is the reason you kept showing up. And Wren. And Caleb. They stood on either side of Nolan and Blaire during the ceremony. Wren in a green dress she'd chosen herself, and Caleb in a collared shirt that he'd put on without complaint, which Nolan privately noted as evidence of how much the day meant to him. They didn't hold flowers or rings, they just stood there, which was the whole point. The judge read the ceremony. Nolan and Blaire said the parts they'd written themselves, which were short and plain and entirely true, because neither of them had the patience for language that reached further than it could honestly go. When it was done, there was a moment, just a beat, maybe 2, where the 14 people on the dock were quiet, and the sound of the water came up through that quiet, and the late September light was the color of something you couldn't name but recognized. And nobody did anything because nothing needed to be done. Then Caleb said, to no one in particular, "Okay, but is there food?" Greta, who had, in fact, arranged food, guided him firmly toward the table. The moment broke into sound and movement, and the ordinary music of people who like each other occupying the same space, and Blaire laughed the full laugh, the one that changed her face, and Nolan watched her laughing, with the particular quality of attention he had, the kind that never made you feel watched. Wren found him an hour later. The party had moved inside as the evening cooled, and Nolan had slipped out to the dock for 5 minutes because he needed 5 minutes of quiet the way he always had. The residual habit of a man who spent years in environments where quiet was rare and therefore valuable. He was sitting at the end of the dock with his jacket on and his shoes off and his feet over the edge, not quite touching the water. Wren sat beside him. She'd taken her shoes off too. They sat there for a moment, listening to the water and the distant sound of the party behind them. Laughter, Caleb's voice identifying some oceanographic fact to an unresisting Mrs. Petrakis, Dev's toast apparently still going in some modified form. "Do you remember the first night?" Wren asked. He looked at her sideways. She was 9 now, nearly 10. She looked older than 9 in some ways, the eyes especially. Always reading, always tracking, and exactly 9 in others, her feet swinging over the dock edge with the unself-conscious rhythm of a child who forgot to be dignified when she was comfortable. "Yeah," he said. "I remember. I said everybody leaves." "You did." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "I was so sure I was right about that." "You had evidence," he said. "Yeah." She turned to look at him. "You said somebody needs to stay." "I remember." "Did you mean it? Like, did you actually mean it then? Or did it just come out?" He thought about it honestly, the way she'd asked it honestly. "Both. Maybe. It came out because I meant it. I didn't think it through first." She considered this. "Is that how you make good decisions? You don't think them through?" "Sometimes the best decisions happen faster than thinking." "That sounds like something that would get you in trouble." "It has," he said. "Also saved me a few times." She turned back to the water. The lights from the house were reflecting off it now, small broken pieces of gold moving on the surface. "You really meant it, didn't you?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Meant what? That somebody needed to stay. He looked at her. She was watching the water, with her chin slightly up, the posture she'd had on that first night, in the kitchen, arms at her sides now. Not crossed, no armor, and he thought about the girl he'd found then, furious and frightened, and armed with a bucket of dirty water, and the absolute certainty that the world would confirm what she already believed. He thought about all the things that had happened between that night and this one. The mop heads, the terrace, the library floor, the fraying stitching on his uniform, the algebra session and the window seat. The hallway in December, her hand in his, the drawing on her wall. The word safe, yeah, he said. "I meant it." She slipped her hand into his. Not the way she'd grabbed it in December, not the deliberate, decided motion of someone choosing to reach. Just naturally, the way you reach for something that's been there long enough that reaching for it isn't a choice anymore, it's just the thing your hand does. They sat there for a while. The dock moved slightly under them, the water doing its water thing. And behind them, the party went on, warm and lit. And somewhere in there, Blaire was laughing, and Caleb was explaining something, and Greta had probably cried again, and Mrs. Petrakis had definitely found someone new to feed. "I want to ask you something," Wren said. "Okay. And I need you to answer it honestly. Not the nice version. Always." She looked at him. "Are you happy?" He held the question for a moment the way it deserved. Not performing consideration, actually considering. He thought about 14 months ago, the warehouse, the Silverado with no heat, Caleb eating cereal alone, the 4-page protocol document for a house he was hired to clean. The loneliness that he'd gotten so accustomed to that it had stopped registering as loneliness and had become simply the texture of his days. He thought about the dock he was sitting on, the sound of laughter from inside, the small hand in his. He thought about what it was to lose someone and spend 2 years surviving the loss rather than living anything else, and then to look up one October evening at a flooded kitchen floor and say something so simple it barely qualified as a sentence, and have that sentence turn into this, whatever this was. Something he didn't have a word for because the word was too large and too ordinary at the same time. The word was home, but that was too small. The word was family, but that was someone else's word for their own thing. It was just this dock, this child, this October to September of a year that had changed the shape of what he understood was possible. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Wren nodded. She looked back at the water. She seemed satisfied with the answer, which was the right reaction, because it had been the true one. "Good," she said. They stayed on the dock until Blaire came out to find them, still barefoot herself, jacket over her wedding dress, hair loose the way Wren wore hers, and stood at the end of the dock, looking at the two of them. "Caleb is trying to explain deep-sea bioluminescence to Greta," she said. "Greta has been very polite for 12 minutes, but I think she's running out of interest." "She can handle it," Nolan said. "I'm not sure she can." Wren got up. "I'll rescue her." She was already moving toward the house, dress hem brushing the dock, entirely at home in her own skin in a way she hadn't been a year ago. She stopped before she reached the door, turned back. "Mom," she said. Blaire looked at her. "I like your hair like that." Then she went inside. Blaire stood at the end of the dock and watched the door close behind her daughter. She stood there for a moment with the sound of the water and the September air and the lights from the house casting their broken reflection on the surface, and she allowed herself to feel the full, complicated, imperfect weight of everything the year had been. The 12 nannies, the 4-page protocol document, The library floor and the books, and her mother's handwriting. The flooded kitchen and a man who picked up a mop. The hallway in December, blue light through the window, a child drawing with steady hands. Pancakes that kept burning. The aquarium. The jellyfish, apparently. The dock. Nolan came to stand beside her. She didn't look at him. She looked at the water. She counted 15 minutes, she said. Yeah, I thought you forgot I told you that. I don't forget much. She was quiet. I think about it sometimes. What would have happened if I'd stayed? Just stayed. You stay now, he said. I know. She turned to look at him. Is that enough? He looked at her the way he looked at things he was thinking about, honestly. It's not about enough, he said. You can't go back and unleave. You can just decide what you do now. Very practical. I'm a practical person. You're an infuriating person, she said. But she was smiling when she said it, the full one, the real one. You knew that going in. I did. She took his hand. I made an informed decision. High compliment from you. The highest, she said. They stood there at the edge of the dock, looking out at the water, and the city lights beyond it, and the vast September dark above. And it was not a perfect evening. Caleb had put something sticky on Greta's tablecloth. And Devlin and Tess had gotten into an argument about something work-related that had been going on for weeks, and everyone could tell. And the cake had been slightly too sweet, and the judge had mispronounced Nolan's last name twice and not corrected himself. None of that made it lesser. That's the thing about real things, they don't need to be perfect to be true. The burnt edges are part of the pancake. The argument at the table is part of the dinner. The mispronounced name is part of the ceremony. And the woman who left for 15 minutes and came back, changed. Over the course of a year, she is also, fully and without reduction. The woman standing on the dock, with her hand in her husband's hand, watching the water. We tell ourselves that love arrives in grand gestures and decisive moments. The people who change our lives announce themselves with drama and clarity. That we will recognize the important things when they happen. But most of the time, the important things arrive quietly. They arrive carrying a mop. They arrive in the back of a pickup truck with broken heat. They arrive in a child's hand slipping into yours, or in a laugh you haven't allowed yourself in years, or in the simple act of one person staying in a room when every part of the situation is telling them to leave. The most powerful thing one person can do for another is so ordinary it barely registers as a thing at all. You stay. You pick up the mop. You knock on the door instead of panicking. You sit on the floor and sort the books. You eat the burnt pancakes without complaint. You show up on Monday and Thursday and Saturday. And then again, until the showing up becomes the language the other person learns to trust. Until they stop holding their breath waiting for you to go. Until they go to sleep and sleep until morning. Blaire Kensington spent 12 years building something extraordinary with her intelligence and her will, and her refusal to be stopped by any obstacle the world put in front of her. True and real and worth saying plainly. But the thing that changed her life, the thing that broke the longest winter her daughter had ever lived through, was not intelligence, and not will, and not the refusal to be stopped. It was a man with a fraying patch on his jacket, who understood, without being told, that the job was never the floors. The job was always the staying. Nolan Rourke had been many things in his life. A sailor, a SEAL, a husband, a widower, a single father eating cereal at a kitchen table in Tacoma at 6 in the morning with broken heater and a boy who loved submarines. A janitor. He was all of those things still. None of them had gone anywhere. But standing on a dock in September with his wife beside him and his son inside, explaining bioluminescence and a girl who had once done everything in her power to make him disappear now, pulling Greta away from Caleb with the satisfied competence of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. He was also finally exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the world arranged it for him. Not because someone handed it to him. Because he'd shown up and stayed and knocked on doors instead of panicking and waited with the particular patience of someone who has learned the hard way that the best things take the time they take and cannot be rushed. Inside the house, Caleb laughed at something Wren said. The sound carried through the glass and across the water. Nolan looked at Blaire. She squeezed his hand once. They went inside.